Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Wawrzyniec Smoczyński. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the last breakout session of this conference of the Wrocław Global Forum. I realize you are all after a very interesting but lengthy debate with the foreign ministers after a coffee break that was way too short, and thinking already about the evening reception. But I want, however, to guarantee that we'll have a very interesting discussion in the next 1 hour, because we'll be actually discussing the one topic that is tangible and very political at the moment in transatlantic relations, namely the trade agreement that is being, mulled at the moment, not negotiated yet, between the United States and the European Union. Before I present the illustrious panel and before we begin the first round of questions, perhaps 3 introductory notes on the negotiations themselves, on the trade talks. Contrary to popular belief, it's not strictly about tariffs. Actually, tariffs between the US and the EU are very low. They are between 3 and 5%. It's a trade negotiation that is essentially about non-tariff barriers, standards, and other regulations which prohibit other European firms entering the US market or American businesses entering the European market. The second important thing to retain is that the issue is deeply contentious. We are actually sitting here while the ministers for trade of the European Union are discussing in Luxembourg and trying to finalize an agreement that would permit the European Union to launch the negotiations and permit Mr. Cameron to begin officially those negotiations during the G8 summit while President Barack Obama will be visiting Europe. It is not at all clear whether it will be possible to overcome the French veto at the moment. And third, which is perhaps least known, especially in Poland, is that trade agreement, those trade talks, are part of a much larger process, a global process, a kind of race between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Namely, there are ongoing negotiations between Japan and the US. There is the upcoming negotiation of another trade agreement between the EU and Europe and US. It's about which negotiation which will set the global standard for another round of trade liberalization, whether it will be the agreement between Europe and America or between America and Japan. With that, I want to finish my contribution and turn to presenting the panelists. With us is Koen Berden, to my far left, who is senior partner at ECORYS Netherlands, assistant professor at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and an expert on trade negotiations. To my left, immediately, Mr. Piotr Jeleński, president of the management board of Asseco Southeastern Europe, the biggest software company in Poland. Tomasz Misiak, to my far right, who is the former chairman of the National Economy Committee of the Polish Senate and an entrepreneur and founder of Workforce, a very big company, a recruitment company from Poland based in Wrocław. To my right is Mr. Jarosław Pietras, Director General at the Council of the European Union, who has participated in many negotiations relating to trade, not only Polish ones. And finally, to my left, between the 2 gentlemen, is Mr. Eric Stewart, the President of the US-Poland Business Council. I myself am Wawrzyniec Smoczyński. I'm the Director for Polityka Insight, which is a new center for policy analysis which produces daily briefings on politics and the economy in Poland. I want to start with Koen and ask him actually for a short update so we all have the same level of knowledge about where actually the US-EU trade negotiations are at the moment, what has already been done, what is more or less the timetable, when can we expect a finale?
Oh, especially that last one is a very interesting question, I think. First of all, thanks very much for having me here. It's very nice to have this discussion with this honorable panel and hopefully later with all of you. I think it's best I mean, we can go back 25 years and see where we are now. I think it's better to go back a little bit over a year when it was decided to start with the high-level working group for growth and jobs, which would actually have to pave the way for looking at whether a deep and comprehensive trade agreement would be possible. They have done this since November 30th, 2011, have worked on this all over 2012, and towards the end have come up with certain recommendations that are of course very important for the starting point of the negotiations. A lot of issues have been mentioned in that report, and if you look at all the documents also of European Parliament, of the committees, they actually take over a lot of these recommendations when it comes to the results of the high-level working group. I think we all know that it became really very important when President Obama mentioned the whole discussion in his State of the Union speech at the beginning of this year, soon followed by Presidents Barroso and Van Rompuy corroborating the EU side of this very high political commitment to these negotiations. We're now a few months further. In the meantime, the Obama administration has submitted the intention to start negotiations to Congress on 20th of March. That actually was a starting period of a 90-day period in which there would be a discussion as to and kind of chance for everyone to create and to give inputs into the process on the American side. We also know that the DG Trade has been very active preparing the drafts for the negotiating mandate from the EU side. A few weeks ago, there has been a vote in Parliament on this first draft of the negotiating mandate. The negotiating mandate was framed as broadly as possible at that moment. I think really stressing the elements, stressing the fact of not to exclude anything from the negotiation a priori. We also know that that was a very interesting debate in Parliament and in the Inter Committee, because there was this discussion about audiovisual equipment. I'm sure we're going to be talking about that a bit more later. And as you said, Mr. Chairman, right now today the trade ministers are actually talking about the result of that vote as well as the negotiating mandate. So those are the two sides where they are, I would say. It is also the fact that in practice, 3 trade rounds or 3 rounds have already been planned informally for this year. Second week of July, then one in September and one in December. So these have already been kind of scheduled, going a bit ahead of negotiating mandates, etc. We all know that there is a very ambitious time path. The Americans call it on 1 tank of gas. They want to finish this. So some say 2014. Others say 2015. It may more likely be 2016. We'll have to see. But indeed, if it has to be on 1 tank of gas, and maybe we can talk about that too a bit later, then you're talking the end of 2015, earliest 2016, for it to have been somehow concluded before either the Barroso administration ends its term, as well as, of course, President Obama's second term. So that's maybe a little bit on the very big scope on the negotiations.
Thank you very much. So let's take the 1 tank of gas and jet across the Atlantic, and let's forget Europe for 1 second and try to get in the mindset of the American negotiator. What is the aims that the American administration wants to achieve entering those negotiations?
I guess is this on? You hearing? Okay. The first question is that 1 tank of gas, is that a hybrid car would, I guess, be the first question, or is it an old diesel, right? I mean, it's hard to say how far the tank will get us. But I think from the U.S. perspective, and of course I represent business, I don't represent the U.S. negotiators, but I would say, you know, we have been working on this, we collectively, the U.S. and European officials, for almost 30 years. We've been talking about this for almost 30 years. This is not something that's brand new. It's not something we just created. We've been talking about the prospects of doing something significant and comprehensive for a very long time. But what is significant is the fact that the president himself, during the State of Union, announced that we were going to go forward with this. This is something that, you know, we haven't we did not accomplish or was not announced during the Clinton administration or either Bush term. So this in and of itself is significant from my perspective. And so the message I would say from the business community is, let's get on with it. Let's do this. Let's make it happen. Even if the agreement isn't a fully comprehensive agreement and it only meets partially the objectives that are set out, this is still a significant opportunity for infusing some jobs, infusing some GDP, as well as trade between our countries, to the tune of billions of dollars. At a minimal, even if we just achieve the minimal within these negotiations, it will still be more significant than the last 3 U.S. free trade agreements that have been negotiated. Just the minimal. I mean, that is how significant this is. So as far as I'm concerned, we use the term too big to fail. This is too big to fail, and we should not let it fail. And if that means having a October 14th time frame, I would say the message from the business community is get it done.
I would have a short follow-up question on that, because what Europeans usually, when they talk about the US-EU trade agreement, don't recognize is the fact that the final deal has to go through Congress. And obviously, you said the business community would be satisfied even with a limited deal. But as I understand, the EU is convinced that essentially agriculture is off the table. The US isn't convinced it is off the table. Would an agreement without agriculture in it actually pass the US Congress, or is there firm resistance towards that? What would be the red lines in political terms?
My personal belief is, and I don't speak for all business, for the whole business community, obviously, because there's no unified voice. But I would say, agriculture, issues of GMOs, we're not going to get it. We're not going to conclude that. We've been negotiating that for 20 years. We're not going to, maybe not 20 years, but a very long time. We're not going to get it done, is my opinion. So there are certain issues I think that should be taken off the table. And we should focus on what can be accomplished. And my understanding is, and maybe our friend from Brussels will correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the plan for negotiations at this point will be 2 tracks. There'll be the track that we believe is quite achievable, and then there'll be the more difficult track. And the hope is, obviously, we can move some of the more difficult issues over to the successful, easier issues. But I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that that train on the easier track, in fact, reaches the station. I think is the message. On the issue of Congress, if the Congress is willing to give the president what we call TPA, or Trade Promotion Authority, then the president does in fact have the ability to negotiate a free trade agreement without sending it to Congress afterwards. But that has to be something that is given to the president by Congress ahead of time, and something that we would strongly recommend, because the last thing you want to do is negotiate terms between Washington and Brussels and then throw something over to Congress. And the way our politics has been over the last few years, forget it. I mean, it won't move out of our Congress.
Thank you. The next question would be to Dr. Pietras regarding Brussels, as already announced, or rather the European position on it. The issue that we are right now facing is semi-opposition from France to beginning a deal where all the areas are essentially on the table. So my question would be, what was the logic behind the idea to think about a mandate as wide as possible, if we are already now, before we even have started negotiations, are facing opposition from such an important country as France? What was the reason why Europe decided to go ahead with such a broad scope for negotiation?
I think that it is important issue of the motives that Europe has with this agreement. And these motives are quite wide and going well beyond simple trade issues. First of all, the whole negotiations with the US and the ideas related to free trade have got a long history. It is not that it has started recently. It's a long history of attempt to liberalize not only trade but economic relations. TAFTA has been discussed already many, many years ago. So there is also a business community that is heavily involved in discussion. And I think especially in a moment of crisis, Europe has got a particular reason to contradict, to counteract the attempts to reduce openness. So I think these negotiations are especially aimed at maintaining openness of Europe, especially that worldwide there is a bit of problem with the negotiations in WTO. So one of the ways to overcome the problems of global negotiations, multilateral negotiations, is to go bilaterally. Therefore, Europe has got negotiations with Korea, with Japan, and with the US, which will be a very logical element. I don't want to speak on the motives of the countries, because I'm not here to represent any country or to and to speak on behalf of the country. But I think that there are some differences where Europe put different accents, and therefore, when we look at the reasons behind the exception, which is called cultural exceptions, it is not yet fully clear what is the content of this exception. And obviously, it is important component. It is important component for some member states. Therefore, it's not only France. There are more countries that are sharing this type of view, that it should be a kind of exception. However, the question is how wide it could be, because some people are saying about cultural industries or creative industries, which goes beyond the traditional understanding of Hollywood and films only. It goes much more widely. And we've got a new phenomena. De facto, one has to relate to the fact that it's not a trade agreement. It's much more agreement that deals with all other elements which are related to trade, with a regulatory framework. So there are a number of other things behind the trade. Tariffs are relatively small. But the question is that contemporary, it is not the biggest barrier. Regulatory differences between US and Europe are quite significant, and they are related, for example, to various health or sanitary conditions, which are different. Minister Sikorski, speaking in just a few minutes ago, was saying about the substances which are used to clean chicken before being shipped, and obviously there's a number of differences in regulatory framework. In all the chemical industry, we've got in European Union very developed legislation, so-called REACH, whereas in US there is a different system, and then these differences has to be somehow overcome, and very often they create a bigger barrier to trade, standard, this type of thing. Obviously, trade negotiations cannot limit or eliminate these things, but they could provide for kind of a regulatory convergence. So it could be element of negotiations. But I think there's a number of elements that would make these negotiations quite difficult. It obviously is fact that it's related to some other areas, like public procurement, which is opening of the government market or government purchases. There is a question of GMOs, which extends not only to products directly done, sorry, not only to GMOs in terms of seeds, for example, of corn or whatever, but also products that are being done on the basis of the GMOs input. Then you've got environmental standards over various ways impacting trade. In Europe, we've got very many discussions concerning so-called residues in food, or we have endocrine disruptors, which are being substances which may have a harmful effect on health, and there are plenty of things of that sort which differs between EU and US. There are also a number of other issues which relates to intra-company, because most of the trade is intra-company trade between, very often there are big companies selling from one side of Atlantic to the other, but within companies very often. So there is a question of this intercompany component, which relates not only to trade as such, but also to services which are provided, also to employees migrating together with the product, also the question of pricing within, and also taxation. When we look, for example, at financial services, because services are part of a component, in the financial services there is also difference of taxation, and now discussion on Tobin tax is also a bit of element. But I think the number of difficulties related to digital economy and everything which relates to digital economy and selling over the internet, and especially when you look at what happens with search engines, big companies like Google or other companies which are present at the European market. Here also there is another question which relates to competition rules, because competition rules may also have impact. And as you know, the Commission has got a number of big questions towards the big American companies like Microsoft or Google concerning competition rules. Also, Europe differs with the US in terms of protection of personal data. And here is a number of things that are related. So this negotiation will be quite complex, and I fully agree that ending this in 2014 is rather wishful thinking than so easy, because it is quite complex set of problems.
So on this optimistic note, we return to the region. Well, it's still better than saying we won't find an agreement, to say that it will happen perhaps in the space of the next 10 years. So let's return to Central Europe. I'm a journalist, and I do follow the issue, or try to do follow the issue in the international press. You actually find nothing about the trade negotiations in Polish press, or at least you couldn't find any article over the past month. Now they start to appear. This trade negotiation, though it includes Poland because Poland is part of the EU, seems not to cause any kind of political or other interest in Poland. In France, for example, one of the reasons why the French government is so anxious to enter in the negotiations is the fact that the National Front is launching actually a campaign before the European elections next year based on opposition to that treaty, that particular treaty. The treaty isn't political in Central Europe. It surely isn't political. The trade agreement isn't political in Poland particularly. Does it mean that firms operating in Poland or in the region like Asseco wouldn't be influenced by that agreement? Is there nothing that a company like yours can gain from a US-European trade deal?
Short term, it's on, yes? Short term, I don't think they will. IT is fairly liberal and it's free in trade. There are non-tariff barriers, but which are more customary, and that's why there is so many acquisitions, which also Asseco follows, to enter certain markets. Mm-hmm. But from a company perspective, it's very difficult for me to comment the process, negotiating process, and when this will reach a success. But from a businessman's perspective, one big wish is to increase the liberal framework and free trade economic framework globally, whether it's Europe, it's US, because on a long-term basis, competitiveness makes us better, yes? On the short term, I think this free trade agreement for some companies can be detrimental, maybe for some chemical industry in Europe. If the shale gas will not be at the same price accessible, for example, in Europe, it might turn that some of the chemical fertilizer producers won't be competitive, yes? But this will be short term. But on a long-term perspective, I do have a lot of hopes that these negotiations will just be an example how to accelerate a certain dialogue and process of liberalization, which should happen globally, but should accelerate in Europe. I just must say it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Dr. Pietras, who was my teaching professor in the beginning of 90s. And I still remember one of the lessons from one of the classes. He said that all unions in the history, especially economic-based, have two directions into which they can develop. They can either become a bigger union and integrate more, or they disintegrate. They never can stand still in the same place. And very much supportive to all free trade, including European unions, I think these negotiations that are happening can be a great boost for any additional non-tariff limitations in Europe, because I do believe today it's not a US-Europe issue. We have a big issue between European EU countries, yes? We do see the same products being priced at 30%, 50% difference with non-transport costs in countries away from 200, 300 kilometers. And this is because of lack of trust, lack of transparency, and non-tariff barriers, yes? And I hope this dialogue and this discussion will also raise awareness within Europe how many things there are to improve to make the free market truly work.
So you yourself, as a businessman, as a manager of a big company operating in Central European software, you're not afraid of software giants entering and devouring your market in the region?
Actually, if you look at the IT scenery, US is absolutely dominant. I mean, Europe has only one truly big IT player, which is global, it's SAP. All the others are very local. And I had comments from big US companies which say, we will not enter European market through acquisitions until the market consolidates. So even Asseco today as a group is 5th largest software producer in Europe, which is surprising to many and not known. Still it's very small by European standards, and all big American companies are present in Eastern Europe, Western Europe. They have their offices, they've entered a long time ago, and they are truly competing. And in most cases, they have won over the market, yes? They've won over the market.
Thank you. And turning to Mr. Misiak and asking, turning to Poland itself, if you could give us a perspective of what the trade deal means for a company like yours, which is operating mostly nationally and very much on the ground here. Is it important? Does it herald any change for you, or is it something that isn't a game changer for your business?
Thank you. Actually, we are operating in 8 countries, so we are present in United Europe strongly already. But if I can comment a little about the momentum we have now with signing this trade agreement, I think that in all economics in the history, it's very important to give some new impact and new impulse to have the possibility to grow in economy. And whatever it is the technological change, like in the history of industrialization, or it is the informatic change like internet, which boosts our effectiveness and allow developed countries to go to another level, more developed now. I think that Europe now is in a very difficult situation because of the crisis we have, because of the high debt level with many of its members, and that agreement between United States and United Europe can be this real impulse to change one more time the economic zone of Europe. And taking into consideration that the United Europe and United States are very similar in many levels of the culture of business, I can say. Of course, we have a lot of differences, like you, for example, say that we have the different law, we have the different regulation. That regulation are especially very painful because there are huge differences, especially in the medical sector, in culture, in all of subsidiaries to the business, in all of the donation, in agriculture. That can be very painful during the negotiation, but still, you cannot compare the business culture and economic culture to the culture of China or Brazil or of these BRIC countries. I'm talking about Brazil, Russia, China, India, and these countries in the future will be very powerful on the economic level. So now I think this is the only possibility for the Western culture, the Western business culture, to protect ourselves in the future economic, I can call it war, yes, but the future economic competition. I have just finished 1 week ago the short 1 week course on ESE Business School, when one of the professor, the advisor of World Bank, showed us how in 2050 would be the production and export of different countries. And really what is going to happen in Europe, we are shrinking down with all of our export and our production, world production and world trade. So we really need to find a solution to improve it, to have this additional impulse. Speaking about Poland, I think that there is a huge huge efforts we should take to understand it, yes? Because for us it can be really changing. But on the other hand, I still would like to come back to some simple discussion, like what about Polish and United States people exchange? I'm talking about visas. So how we can do the free trade if we cannot have visas, if somebody can reject going into the United States by blocking the entrance to the United States. So it is not speaking about the free trade, we also should speak about the free people exchange and companies exchange, because without this it would be very difficult to speak that Polish businessmen and Polish people can have the real participation in the free trade agreement. So we should come back during this discussion in United Europe about this equal treatment of United Europe citizens in all of this economic cooperation. The second issue I'd like to mention is that for now, Poland probably is not involved so much because United States are still a very small partner in exports for us. We mostly are cooperating with Germans, United Europe, and this is the biggest impact on our economy. I remember that Poland in German import is now one of the top 10 countries, so we are very important for European countries, not so important for Americans. But still I believe that we'll need to be involved in this negotiation very shortly, because for our companies and especially the service company, because Poland is very, very strong with the services like software, like the professional services in outsourcing. We have more than 60% of our GDP out of the services now, not only import. So we should really be present there, and I think we are, because you are present directly in United Europe and you are Polish, so you are presenting also our point of view, not only European point of view. And to finish my short thinking about this whole issue, I believe that Polish companies can have a huge opportunity by this trade agreement, and we should really look into this as an opportunity, not something which can hurt us. And this will be the main methodology of how Polish business should come to this issue.
Thank you. Before we open up the floor, because I would like us to engage in a discussion rather than simply us talking, I want to turn once again for a second to Professor Berden to tell us a little bit about the more specific non-tariff barriers that there are that might be an issue in the negotiations that we perhaps tend to overlook when we look too generally on the issue.
All right. I think quite a few of them were already mentioned. But there are a few points I think that are worth stressing in terms of also some of the comments I heard. First, when we talk about transatlantic versus trans-Pacific discussion, that's typically a US debate, because it's either to the left or to the right. But we need to be very careful that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is really a tariff-driven free trade agreement. So it's not at all the same depth, the same level of integration that we're talking about in the TTIP, the transatlantic deal. So in that sense, the whole discussion on standards, regulatory alignment is a TTIP, a transatlantic discussion, and not at all very strongly on the agenda for the TPP. That's very important, because when you look at the economic effects of the trade agreement we're now discussing between the EU and the United States, the expected impact is a 200 billion per year impact on EU and US when it comes to non-tariff barriers, and it's about 10 to 13 billion per year when it comes to the remaining tariffs. So the whole regulatory issue is a factor 15 to 20 times more important than we're discussing in the more traditional trade agreements, the tariff parts. I think it's a very important point to make. It doesn't mean, however, that tariffs are not important anymore. That's what you then hear as a consequence. Okay, so tariffs don't matter anymore because they're 3%, 4%. If you discuss with the chemical industry who trade between the European Union and the United States, they actually say that even though a certain tariff on certain chemical products is only 4 or 5%, realize that within the companies, these products are traded across the Atlantic 5 or 6 times. First, as a raw material, it moves from the EU to the US. Then as a semi-processed product, it moves back to the EU. And then it moves as a final product back to the US. So in some cases, these tariffs of only 3 to 4% add up to 15 to 20% when you see how often that same product moves across. So I think that's important to add. When we talk about these barriers, and there are a few very contested issues, genetically modified organisms, the chemical sector with REACH and the TSCA system, that's a very tricky issue. Public procurement, as soon as it touches defense, it gets very difficult. And the way Europe looks at public procurement is a very different way from the way the United States looks at public procurement, where the relationship with defense is much stronger. In Europe, we have EU member states who have looked at supranational EU competences for a long time, which is a bit different in the United States. So those, I think, are very important issues. On intellectual property right, the alignment is already much stronger at the outset. I know you have the big discussions on ACTA. I totally sympathize with those, but at least compared to countries like China and other BRIC countries, the alignment is already very high. So when we look at some of the difficult issues, we also, being an economist, I can say that for me, the whole chicken discussion economically, it's a joke. We're talking 20 million euros per year. That's 0.0000 something % of the trade relationship. The fact that it has been so dominant in making this relationship difficult is, in a way, a bit sad to see, because economically, it doesn't matter. And I think what is very useful is if, when you're in these negotiations, you look not just, of course, at the political impact and the differences that there are, but the fact that the discussion on REACH is way more important than a discussion on pathogen treatment of chickens in terms of these trade relationships. When we talk about ending the agreement, I think there's another very crucial point to make. I don't believe 2014 is feasible, but what I'm curious to see is whether the EU and US are able to set up an institutional framework as part of this agreement that will far outlast the 2014, 15, 16 agreement. Because the whole discussion about different rules and regulations between the European Union and the United States is one that we have today, it's one we had 25 years ago, it's one we will have in 25 years from now, because we don't know the new types of divergences that are going to come up. If you look at nanotechnologies, 5 years ago it was not on the agenda, now we start to realize that the US uses different rules and regulations on nanotech than the EU does. So in 5 years' time, if we don't do anything now, it is a new non-tariff barrier. So what I'd be curious to see in these negotiations is not just whether we tackle individual barriers, because that's sometimes very difficult. It's rather whether we're going to be able to set up a system that helps us to streamline these things before they really start to materialize. Maybe one last point from my side, Mr. Chairman, and that's we discuss a lot about the geopolitical implications of this trade agreement. And because it's about standards, it is a lot more, it's very geopolitical. We also hear that this is kind of a window of opportunity that's going to close because China is coming up, India is coming up, and in 10, 20 years' time, they set the standards, if not for a joint EU-US standard at the moment. There is a very interesting case in point that details this a bit more. Already now, the BRIC countries are very important in the standard-setting debate. The reason is not the fact that they set a standard, but it's the fact that the EU and the US do not have harmonized standards. So when you look at for example, the accounting standards, we have IFRS in Europe, you have the US GAAP system in the United States. The moment China and Russia and Brazil chose for the EU system, the global system went the EU way. And that meant, and that means actually already today, we allow BRIC countries to be kind of regulatory tipping point nations. When they choose one system, either the EU or the US system, the global pressure to converge to that system starts to increase. Do we want that tipping point power somewhere, or do we want to discuss it? That's an important point. And the other one is, when you harmonize standards, you reduce the cost for companies. If a car producer has to stick to all the EU rules on producing a car, and then in the US to all the US rules on producing a car, that is extremely costly. So the whole gain is a lot for companies, and that makes them more competitive. As a matter of fact, the Chinese already use standards as a protectionist device to hinder the more competitive US and American firms to compete at the same level. If you look at Wi-Fi and the Chinese equivalent, they're on purpose not perfect substitutes. Just a few points. There, pass to you the floor.
Just a very short comment. I fully agree with the rational economic argument for taking away those barriers. But one thing that we omit in technical or more specific discussions is that that agreement has to be sold not only in Washington to Congress, but also to individual countries, member countries of the EU, to their voters. Perhaps it won't be discussed widely in Poland, but it will surely be discussed next year and the coming years in France. With that, I want to say that we have still half an hour left, and would be very glad to take questions from the audience in order to enlarge our discussion. There's a gentleman who wanted to take the floor.
Hello, my name is Adam Olszewski. I'm the Chief of Staff for the International Trade Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and I'm curious about standards, again, diving a little more deeply into that. In particular, the role of businesses in developing standards. In the United States, businesses develop standards. In Europe, they don't. We see that in Poland, there's some challenges with U.S. businesses and their willingness to invest here, because they don't quite understand the regulatory environment or the standard setting, and they don't necessarily have a say up front. So when Poland, for instance, delivers its energy policy soon, hopefully, the U.S. business community has not, well, they have some clue, but not really an understanding of what that would look like, because they weren't invited to the table. I'm not sure that other companies were either. So in this negotiation, the TTIP, I'm curious from the panelists, what you, especially from our friends in Europe, what you, especially the professor in particular, professors, I guess, in particular, what your thinking is in terms of the business community's role in the development of standards, and if you think it's a good idea, if you think Europe can do that, because it's a cultural shift, or, because I can tell you right now in the United States, it's going to be a huge cultural shift to not allow it. So where do you see that falling in that sort of, on that time, or that frame?
Do you want to go one by one, or perhaps are there any other questions, so we could perhaps take two or three?
Yeah. Then we can pick the ones we like.
Grzegorz Kozłowski, Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Americas Department. I also have a question to Professor Pietras. Some of the US businessmen are saying that we do have a free trade agreement with Korea. European Union is having a free trade agreement of Korea, so it would be pretty simple to have negotiations. What do you think about that? Thank you.
I will have later on a question in return to you, since you said you're from the foreign ministry, regarding Poland's position before the negotiations, but we'll leave that for a few minutes later, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about it, because we really lack here in our panel a participant from the Polish government side. But I would return to Dr. Pietras with the questions.
Maybe start with the standards. Obviously, the situation in Europe is more complicated because standards can be set by business as well. But the question is that very often they are being supported by the regulation, which is over the standards and which is promoting certain type of standard. And then you've got a more complicated situation that you've got member states already deciding about number of things related to technical aspects, and then suddenly you've got realization that in Europe you've got a different situation, different member states, therefore there is a need for more uniform approach. I was a few days ago at the meeting with the Japanese ambassador who on discussion on EU-Japan free trade, and he said it's very strange that Europe, before we even entered real negotiations, already has decided on the plug for electric cars. And obviously, you know, this plug is not a very innocent thing because it relates not only to the small technical device, it relates to the whole system, which will involve the cars, smart energy networks, possibility of charging batteries in a car, but also possibility of using energy stored in batteries of the car to the network. So it's quite a complex system. And once you do that, obviously you, to a certain extent, decide what will be done. The problem is that in Europe, we don't yet have a uniform standard of that, but there are two different major standards already competing with some other variation as well. And then it's a question, which one will be selected even within Europe? So the issue is also within Europe to have different standards and countries or companies standing behind the standards. The issue is not so simple. The business has got a role in defining standards. However, in Europe, there is a much bigger role of public authorities in then putting the elements of these standards or requirements into legislation. So that's also element of a difference between, as I understand, the EU and the American system. The question is with Korea is that it cannot be so easily compared. We are talking here about much different impact on economies. What was easy to discuss with an economy which has got not so visible impact on European industries, it will be much more difficult, even if it will be the same issue, to discuss in the US. And the question is, and that's a very fair point, agreement with the US has to be solved. So it has to be significant enough in Europe for businesses and for societies, for men, to show the benefits out of this, and not only hardships. Just look at possible implications for some industries. You know, free trade is good, competition is good, provided that it affects any other industries than our own. If it affects our own industries, then we start to think maybe it would be better to still be a bit protected. So you have to show qui pro quo. You have to show to economies we are going to gain in this, and this another area. And obviously, in order to gain this, we have to agree for concessions here and there. So it will be much more complicated, even if it covers exactly the same areas, because impact will be much greater.
Yeah. Real quickly on the standards and regulation issue, this is why I believe, and going back to your point, Mr. Professor, this is why I believe that we need to move this process, we need to move it quickly, because there are such big divergences between the way we develop standards and the way we develop regulations. These are not just different systems, these are different philosophies that our societies have bought into. And so whether it's the U.S. developing theirs from a business standpoint, or the European Union developing theirs from a Brussels standpoint, whether it's REACH and a precautionary system, whether it's GMOs, I mean, we're not going to resolve these issues by October of 2014. So my belief is, again, that we've been discussing these issues for 20 plus years. We need to put those issues on this track, and we need to resolve what we can get done by 2014. And the reason I say that, again, reiterating what I said from the beginning, because we have the political will at the highest level that we have not had previously. In previous years, we have not had this high of political buy-in from the U.S. President and from the European Commission. The Commission will change in November of 2014. There'll be European elections. Then in 2015, our U.S. elections kick in. I mean, we can use this excuse over and over again that, you know, politics gets in the way. So don't let politics get in the way. Get it done by October of 2014, whatever you can get done. And I love the tariff argument. I actually hadn't heard that before. It's a great argument why the tariffs do matter as you're exporting back and forth. I would also just quickly, what's in it for Poland in this discussion? I wasn't asked that question, but I'm going to take the prerogative to answer anyway. I think this is a great opportunity for Poland and the U.S. to work closely together, because and frankly, I would throw Lithuania in there as well, because they're going to have the presidency of the European Union. I think this is a great opportunity for the U.S. working with its friends in Central Europe, who take a much more pro-business, I believe, approach to a lot of the issues that we're discussing and debating, and I think could actually be extremely useful in the negotiations to hopefully bring us closer to some decisions that will get us to where we need to go ultimately. And then the last point that I wanted to quickly make, just in case I didn't get a chance to talk again, the last point I wanted to quickly make was the opportunity for the future regulations and future standards. And I think that's a critical component, going back to the first question of what we can't get done by 2014. What we can't get done is a lot of these issues of GMOs, REACH, et cetera, but put the issue of standards and regulations on the table for working together as we develop new standards and new regulations, that we communicate, we talk. We're doing this now, the US and Europe. Continue to do that to make sure that future regulations and standards, while they may not be exactly the same, they're mutually recognized, they're harmonized, they're at least appreciated, we've at least discussed it with each other before we go and create our entirely different systems that are not compatible. So those are my 4 points. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to, are there any other questions from the audience at the moment? Ambassador.
May I take one more chance to come back to the question on standards for just one moment? Because this is, for both sides of the Atlantic, a very confusing issue. If you talk to American firms, they believe that European standards are compulsory, that it's kind of public, government-driven standard system that does not allow for a big role. And when they then look on the European side, that industry is picking up this agreement much less than on the US side, they see this kind of confirmed. I think it's very important to realize, and I think the electrical car, the Japanese ambassador should not be surprised, because this is definitely a preemptive move in a sense, I would say, which is in any case part of the EU-US electrical car agreement on standards. What you see with standards, I think that's very important, is that the European standards are voluntary in nature. But the European thinking comes from preserving the internal market. That's been the driving force for the last 60 years. Is that going to change? No. If you have a different standard, a US industry standard, that comes into Poland and says, look, we want to produce it our way, that is technically possible. The only problem there is that you need to prove equivalence to the EU standard the same way as a Dutch national standard has to prove equivalent to the European standard as well. And the burden of proof, the costs for proving that, lie with industry. So the standard is not compulsory, it's voluntary, but it's costly to prove if you want an alternative standard. It's not impossible, but it's expensive. And I think that's the main problem or one of the main problems in the standard debate.
Mr. Jeleński wanted to come back to the standard debate, and we'll just return in a second to give the possibility to Mr. Ambassador to ask the question.
Robin Barnett, the British Ambassador. I have 2 quick questions to anyone who'd care to answer them. The first is, does the panel think that the work that the OECD has been doing, which suggests that we might benefit from having a rather more sophisticated understanding of where a product that's originally produced in Poland finally ends up, might help in terms of having a conversation around the wider benefits of free trade and of TTIP? And my second question, given what Foreign Minister Sikorski said regarding the immense benefits of TTIP, does the panel think that the best way forward is to treat this rather more as a political negotiation than a traditional trade and economic one? Thank you.
Those are tough ones, so I'll leave the volunteers for those questions, which I believe are on my right and on the far left, to take a moment and let Mr. Jeleński.
No, please answer the question.
Thank you very much for this question. I think you are right saying that the traditional trade negotiations are these days very rare and difficult to conduct. because even if you look at WTO, the problem is that you don't have much quid pro quo. You don't have, we are entering with WTO compared to GATT much wider set of issues and problems than simple movement of goods from one part to another. It's always related to something, to much more. And for example, for this particular agreement, one of the issues which will also be controversial will be rules of origin. Once you've got a free trade agreement, the question of rules of origin, how they will apply it, and where product exactly is originating, and what kind of component of this product are originating in the country. Very often, I mean, I remember a story from the US that in San Francisco, I believe, the city of San Francisco wanted to modernize trams at the city, and finally the Japanese company Komatsu has won. And then there was a political issue, why Japanese? And then the second was John Deere. So everything was changed, some penalties paid and so on. And then suddenly has appeared that Komatsu has got a factory in the US and producing very close in California, whereas John Deere is producing in Malaysia. So the question is, you've got a Japanese name, but American content, or an American name, but Japanese content. These things becomes much more complicated these days because products are not just single piece of coal, which can be said it comes from this place, this mine, but it's much more complicated products containing plenty of elements which together give value added. And this value added is also intellectual property, is many other things which are contained in the product. And therefore it's much more complex issue. And I think OECD is doing quite a big work. However, the OECD is trying to push ideas, but it's not necessarily very quickly to be implemented in practice. And I think this agreement with the US could set some standards which potentially in the longer run could be helpful for bringing back on track multilateral negotiations of the WTO.
If I can add something, sorry, because I think the main question you asked about it was, it is the trade agreement or is the political issue? I think it will be ever political issue, because we are speaking here about set up the standards, but the standards, it doesn't mean only the law standards, the legal solution. It's also about the property of the standard. Who owns the property of the standard? This is the cash, this is the economy. So, of course, if the standard is registered in the United States or in Europe or whatever the place, and then somebody has a dividend out of the standard, because it is the standard of the whole industry, but somebody has been a founder of this standard, somebody has the right to use these standards. And this fight is all the time around the world, so we cannot tell that now the countries will resign from the power of their economy. So United States, for example, now have a huge advantage of this shale gas production, and of course they are trying to develop in Europe. I probably think that your question have referred also to energy in Poland regulation. It's also mainly to the shale gas, because I know that the companies from the United States are not very happy about what is going on here, where we are changing our position very often. Maybe because we don't have set up standards on this area, and the Polish solution, the legal solution, were until now against the country interest. So because of that, we have to find the right solution for our standards, and then we can support the companies also in Poland to be in this production, not to sell all of our resources to international players before we start to be developed here. So I think it always will be the political issue, and we cannot forget about it.
Professor Berden, should we turn the whole negotiation purely political? Should we make it
you
political?
ask an economist on purpose. Well, I think one of the things I learned in doing these kind of advice is that they're always political. It's economics and politics at the same time. The EU member states want to know what it means for them, even though there is an EU negotiating mandate. The committees of jurisdiction on Capitol Hill want to know. The senators want to know what it means for their state. The House representatives want to know what it means for their congressional districts. So I mean, in the end, that's exactly one of the things we're doing now, is disaggregating this. And that means you enter the realm of political economy, which it has always been. I think what is the difference is that indeed, I support the previous speaker, that the deep and comprehensive nature of the trade agreement makes it much more far-reaching than a tariff-driven trade agreement. So in that sense, the political implications are much bigger. And that kind of clear distinction is even more blur than it was already with traditional trade agreements. And I think those elements make it kind of impossible to distinguish between the two. The other is, of course, that in Europe we have, since the coming into effect of the Lisbon Treaty, also a different dynamic going on when it comes to the role of European Parliament, which we have already seen, than was the case with previous agreements. So it's a discussion that you can go on for a long time about, but I would say essentially it is a political decision after you do a lot of economics.
Mr. Jeleński.
I just wanted to refer to the issue of political or non-political and standards, because I think they have a lot to do with each other. First of all, if we look 150 years ago or 100 years ago, when European or US economy have experienced the biggest growths in history, there was no standards. Then the standards started popping up as a security issue to increase the security. But today, majority of standards, I believe, are protectionist standards. Yes, and they are introduced in many tender procedures. They are introduced in many procurement procedures, just to protect. Referring to your question and comment about how the standards are set, yes, the tradition in Europe is etatist, is state-based, very negative. In US, it's business-based. There's huge danger in having businesses setting up standards as long as there's no competition. If there's a big competition, the businesses setting standards compete between themselves, and at the end, they set competitive standards, which are good for everybody, yes? But with Europe being much less competitive than US, there is a deadlock, yes? Because if you allow for the businesses to set standards, it's much easier to lobby. If you take only Polish example, yes, the social lobbying, the economic lobbying is so weak, yes, that if one company has professional approach and professional lobbying, they can set the company standards, not economy standards, because there's no competition that will make sure this should be competitive. And what I believe to be a bit provocative, that this free trade agreement is a great thing, but this will lead to very huge political tensions long term, and this is very good, especially for Europe, because it will show even more than it does today how uncompetitive Europe is. And that Europe is old man of the world, yes, with a social, we had on yesterday, one of the debates stated that I think Europe has more than 50% of social spending of the world, yes, with economy contributing much less than that. And this cannot be maintained. And as you reduce tariffs and standards, you see much more clear picture of who is competitive, who is not. And who will say this to the European society with time? Because society will be faced, on a long-term basis, society will win. On a short-term basis, this will create maybe some additional unemployment, some bigger competitiveness, and losses of some of the enterprises, because they will not manage to compete with highly professional US companies.
So the old man, we are not only old, but we also have this one tank of gas left. We have just 2 minutes left before we have to close the session. There was one last comment that
I can just
Berden
add one sentence. I
make.
think the major driving force for the US doing industry standards is the whole idea of approach to risk and litigation. If you make a mistake as an American company and something goes wrong with an industry-driven standard, you're held liable, and that can destroy your company. So it's not I think that is a much stronger force than the competitive effect. And I'll give the 1.5 minutes back to the chair.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pietras has been checking on the email whether the negotiations in Luxembourg have come to an end. They haven't. So by way of introducing some democratic standards, I wanted to ask all of you to raise your hand whether you think that we will have an agreement by the end of 2015. What's your hunch? Will we have an agreement by 2014? Could you raise your hand? Who thinks we'll have an agreement by 2014? Just one representative from the US. There is a British volunteer. We have a Belgian volunteer. It's a typical discussion in Europe. Everybody is pessimistic, but we all hope. We prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. So thank you very much for participating in this panel. Thanks to the panelists.